The demarcation between.
Okay, so here we are. We're up to episode 5 of our weekly Tanya class. We're now about halfway through the first chapter, and we were discussing how we were trying to better understand what is this thing called a Beinoni, as we were figuring out how Rabbah, who was a great sage, a tzaddik, really, a truly righteous man, a wise man and a scholar and a righteous man as well, called himself a Beinoni. We said that certainly he can't be the true definition of a Beinoni because he never stopped learning Torah even for a moment, and on and on and on. Basically, that can't be what a Beinoni really is. And we still don't know quite what a Beinoni is, because it can be somebody who does some sins and not, and some of the time, because that would make somebody a Rasha, a truly definitively a wicked person, at least at that moment. Once he does tshuva, that's a different story. Then he's a tzaddik. So what exactly is this concept of a Beinoni? So we've established that a Beinoni is somebody who doesn't even have on his repertoire, on his resume, the sin of Bittul Torah, which is, as we've explained, is a very difficult thing to abide by, which is not even wasting a moment of Torah, of an opportunity to study Torah, right? Like on when you have a day off from work, to spend that whole day learning Torah. Unless, I don't know, your washing machine broke, for example, and you have to go to Home Depot to buy a new washing machine. Okay, fine. Even then, you listen to a podcast, a Tanya shir on the way or something,
Right.
But that's very difficult. That's a very high standard to abide by. And yet we're saying that a Beinoni is somebody who abides by even this standard of not wasting a moment of Torah study. So that helps us understand why Rabbah thought of himself as a Beinoni, because, at least on the outside, a Beinoni is a pretty lofty level. And although incorrectly, he had reason to accuse himself of being a Beinoni and not the true level of a tzaddik, which is where he was. Now, if you don't have the page that we're on, I believe, here, I have the link saved. I'm going to post it in the chat. We're up to the footnote, which is in the gray zone, about halfway down this page that I'm going to post now in the chat. There we go. So this is a footnote that theoretically you could understand the chapter even without it, but this is where it fits in as part of the chapter. So the Alter Rebbe says like this: Umasha Kasuv B'Zohar, that which it says in the Zohar, Chela Gimel Daf Reish Lamed Aleph, section 3, page 231. Kol Shemuatin Avaynosav V'Chulu, whoever has a lesser amount of sins is called a tzaddik, meaning if you have more merits than sins, then you're called a tzaddik. Basically, the Zohar says a story that Rav Amnuna found Eliyahu, his teacher, and he said that why is it that that some righteous people have bad experience in this world, that they suffer in this world? Could it be because that's the kind of righteous person who is not completely righteous, but just mostly righteous, and therefore he's getting punished in this world? Basically, there's this concept that, if you wonder why bad things happen to good people in this world, it's because, the really good stuff, the real good reward comes in the next world. The real bad, let's call it consequence, also comes in the next world. But in order for Hashem to grant a tzaddik a completely clean slate in the netherworld, He says, you know what? Let's take care of business. Let's make you pay up, so to speak, of what you owe here in this world. And yes, it'll be uncomfortable and whatever, but compared to the netherworld, it's like nothing. So this way, we'll take care of all the suffering and all the hardship here in this world. And when you get to the netherworld in the afterlife, then you'll have, a clean slate. You'll go straight into Gan Eden, and you'll be able to, have a good life there. So, Rav Amnuna is asking Eliyahu, is this how we characterize a tzaddik virale, a tzaddik who experiences bad in this world? Is that sort of where it fits in? Now, this seems to contradict what we're saying, that even a Beinoni doesn't sin at all. So why are we saying that a tzaddik is somebody who has a minority of sins? So the Alter Rebbe answers, you have to understand, he sheilas Rav Hamnuna le'Eliyahu. This is only the question that Rav Hamnuna asked Eliyahu. In other words, Rav Hamnuna was not stating this as fact, but he was asking as a question to clarify what the truth is. But aval lefi teshuvas Eliyahu sham, but based on Eliyahu's response to this question, perush tzadik v'ralehu k'mayshukasem Rai Mehemna parshas mishpatim d'il. It's exactly in line with what we explained earlier from the Rai Mehemna, that a tzaddik is somebody who has absolutely no sins at all. And if you wonder why a tzaddik may suffer in this world, why, as the saying goes, bad things happen to good people, it's not because of his own sins, but rather because of the sins of the generation. And there is such a thing sometimes that a tzaddik accepts the brunt of the punishment for the generation. We can go into what exactly a tzaddik is and why it works that way, but that's not for now. So, now we understand that the true meaning of a tzaddik virale, a tzaddik, that is to him, is not talking about a tzaddik who experiences a bad life, which is because he has, some sins, but rather we're talking about a tzaddik who the evil is to him, meaning that he's subjugated, he controls the evil all within him. Now, you might ask, so where did Rav Hamnuna even get this idea of this tzaddik being somebody who has a minority of sins? He says, maybe this was from the perspective of Veshivim Panim La Torah. There's this concept that there's 70 faces to the Torah. Every concept in Torah could be explained from 70 angles. So he said, look, I understand that's not the true meaning of what a tzaddik is, but maybe from one angle or another, you can explain that a tzaddik is somebody who has a minority of sins. But ultimately, even that wasn't the case. And the answer that Eliyahu said was, that's not either the truth. It's not even one of the 70 meanings of what a tzaddik virale is. But at least the question is a valid one, even though we clarify that that's not truly what a tzaddik is. So now that we finished the footnote, we'll go back into the actual text of the chapter. In the online version, it's right after the shaded box. Or if you're looking in a classical Tanya, it's on the second side of the page, which is where the Tanya begins. It's kind of, well, you won't be able to see it in my blurred screen. So anyways, it's on page 10, the 5th line. So, V'hada Amrinan Ba'alma. Now, there's a common way that people speak, which is the mechza al mechza mikre beinoni. Someone who has half and half is called a beinoni, meaning if you have half merits and half demerits, you're called an intermediary person, a regular guy, a run-of-the-mill, everyday person. And then another type of person is v'raiv zechuyos. Somebody who has a majority of merits is mikre tzaddik. It's called a tzaddik. So now that clearly is not what we're talking about here in Tanya. So where does this idea even come from? Is this just totally false and should be done away with? Where does this even come from? So the Alter Rebbe says, don't jump on it so quickly. It's not so terrible. It's just a borrowed term. It's not an accurate term, but it's a borrowed term in terms of reward and punishment. Because the person is normally judged after his majority. And he's called a tzaddik in court because he's found meritorious. In other words, think of tzaddik and Russia not as righteous and evil, but think of it as not guilty and guilty, right? So the court comes down and says, you are found guilty, right? Does that mean that you're an evil person in every respect? No, it means guilty that whatever, you have to pay the parking ticket, whatever it might be, right? Now, that could be your only violation in your entire life, but in this regard, we're giving you the title and the label of guilty, right? The label of, so to speak, Russia. And similarly, if it turns out that in court you're not guilty, so we'll say zakai in Hebrew, or not guilty, which is synonymous in this sense with the word tzaddik. So we're not saying that, oh, you're a tzaddik, you do everything right and everything you do is perfect. No, in regard to this particular parking ticket that we're discussing, you're found righteous. You're found not guilty. Okay, fine. That doesn't speak to your true essence of who you are as a person. In fact, it's none of the business of the court in that moment to start assessing your entire life and figure out who you are at your very core. That's not the point over here. So from that perspective, yeah, we sometimes use these terms of tzaddik, Rasha, Beinani. Beinani might be the case of a hung jury, right? You can't decide if he's guilty, is he not guilty, right? It's neither here nor there. Now, again, it doesn't speak of who you are. And over here in Tanya, we're not becoming judges. We're becoming better people. We got to get to our core, right? So in that respect, these borrowed terms are not appropriate for what we're trying to accomplish in Tanya. We're trying to get to our very core. So now that we've proven, just to frame this in different words, now that we've proven that a Beinani is not somebody who has half sins and half merits, certainly a tzaddik has no sins at all. We're just explaining why sometimes a tzaddik is a name that's used for somebody who has mostly merits. And he says that the term tzaddik in those cases is because in a court of law, that person would be found not guilty, meaning in God's court of law, in God's judgment of good versus bad, the person will have a favorable judgment because he's mostly good. And it's not coming to describe the person's true essence of who he is. And that's what we call a borrowed term, because we're finding one detail which we're discussing, and we're using these names of tzaddik, Rasha, and Beinani to describe the person in the context of that particular question at hand, that particular violation or not non-violation. Just to clarify another example, what would be a borrowed term? You say somebody has a heart of stone. Say, well, we did a CAT scan, and actually it's a heart with a lot of blood and veins. And what do you mean a heart of stone? But it's a borrowed term. In other words, just like a stone is very heavy and it's difficult to penetrate, this person's heart is difficult to penetrate. It's heavy. It's not easily inspired, so to speak, right? So that's another example of a borrowed term. It's not, you don't always take the term literally. Aval, the Alter Rebbe continues, Aval in an amitas shema terva maila. But in regards to the true description and the true praise what a tzaddik is, but shalmailus and madrigas chalukais tzaddikim ubeinanim, of the greatness and the distinct levels, which there are many of within the ranks of tzaddikim and beinanim. So that is something else entirely. Amru Razal, that's where our sages say, and was quoted earlier in the beginning of the chapter, tzaddikim yetzer tov shayftan, that the tzaddikim are ruled entirely by their yetzer tov, by their divine inclination, by their good inclination. Shenamar, as it says in a verse in Tehillim, v'libi chalal bekirbi, my heart is hollow within me. Over here, the heart is a reference to the natural animalistic tendencies. The animal soul, which we'll get to explaining, is totally eradicated. It's entirely hollow inside of him. What does that mean? She'ein la yetzer hara, that the person has no evil inclination. Why not? Ki haraga b'tainus, because it was killed through fasting. This is a verse in Tehillim which David HaMelech is saying that his heart was hollow and empty inside of him because through fasting and through painting his body, he was able to eradicate the Yetzer Hara. It's interesting, the Alter Rebbe talks about later in Tanya that that we need to work on refining our animalistic tendencies. And not just we need to refine them, but if we don't, the default is that it'll grow, it'll metastasize into a bigger and greater animalistic soul. Why? Because we eat every day. And which side of us? Is it the godly soul or the animal soul that eats? It's the animal soul that lives off, the food that we eat. So if we're eating and not being intentional with our eating and not specifically eating for the sake of serving Hashem, then that eating automatically gets, by default, routed to the energy of the animalistic soul. And therefore, the animalistic soul grows, it metastasizes, it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, and becomes much more difficult to overpower. And then when the animal soul tells you to do an actual bad thing, like, say, God forbid, to eat not kosher food, right? Then the animal soul is so powerful, it's hard to overcome it at that point. Where did it come from? Because we were just letting it take its natural course of not eating intentionally with the focus to refine ourselves. So the opposite of that would be to specifically not eat with any sense of enjoyment. In other words, not only to eat with a sense of purpose so that we can serve Hashem better and things like that, but even the eating itself, we specifically don't enjoy. And that's what David HaMelech accomplished. He actually managed to eradicate the desire for evil altogether, the animalistic inclination altogether, and he eradicated the negative soul. This is what we call iskafia, breaking the animalistic soul. An example of how somebody would do that, and I'm not necessarily saying it's recommended for everybody, but this is something that David HaMelech did, and perhaps a somewhat recent example was the Mashpia in Brunois, the spiritual mentor in the Chabad Yeshiva in France, which I spent a summer there, actually. His name was Reb Nissan Nemenov, if I'm not mistaken. This line comes from him. He says, look, I understand you have to eat bread. You got to eat bread. And I understand you also got to eat butter because butter has certain nutrients that bread doesn't have. But who says you have to eat the butter on the bread? Have plain bread and a scoop of butter separately. The fact that you enjoy the butter smeared on the bread, and by the way, it has to reach every corner, as we all know. Otherwise, we're not doing the true cuisine, right? So that's already giving into our animal soul. We're not saying literally to fast all the time, then you'd not be alive anymore, right? That would be defeating the purpose. But at least even within the eating, not only to do it for a divine purpose, but also to eliminate the animalistic enjoyment therein. So that's something that David HaMelech, King David, managed to do, and eradicate his negative inclination. So that's a tzaddik. That's a true, bona fide tzaddik. Avol, but kol mi shelo higia l'madrega zu, anybody who did not reach this level, which is the vast majority of us, even though that person's merits far outweigh his sins, he's not on the level or the rank of a tzaddik at all. He's not a tzaddik v'tovlo, a tzaddik who good is to him. He's not a tzaddik v'ralo, a tzaddik which bad is to him. He's not a tzaddik. V'lachein amru razal b'medrash, and therefore our sages tell us in the medrash, Ra HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'tzaddikim shehem muatim. God saw that tzaddikim are very few in number, meaning he foresaw before creation, in the beginning of time, that there will not be that many tzaddikim. Amad ushtalam b'chol davadar. So he got up, he set them up, he placed them in different generations. Why does he have to place them in different generations? So it says that a tzaddik is the foundation of the world. And we're talking about a true tzaddik, meaning the world cannot exist without at least one true tzaddik in the generation. So he had to spread them out evenly or somewhat evenly, so that every generation has a tzaddik during that generation that could truly exemplify this bona fide version of a true, thoroughly tzaddik kind of person. But the rest of us, we're not expected to do that. So that explains why why we're saying that there are very few tzaddikim in every generation, because to be a true tzaddik in this sense is a highly difficult achievement. Now, even though we explained in this chapter that a Beinoni is someone who has no sins, the Alter Rebbe will explain later, once he explains many other things about this battle that the Beinoni experiences. He says that a Beinoni is something that everybody can be and should try to be, which is difficult even in and of itself. However, the battle to try to be a Beinoni at every moment is something that is meant for every single Jew. And that's why the Alter Rebbe called the book of Beinonim, because the way to achieve Beinoni status is something that can be worked on by each and every single person. So, just to summarize what we've learned this week and also a little bit last week, is we clarified that a Beinoni is not somebody who has half sins and half merits, because firstly, Rabbah would never make a mistake to call himself a Beinoni if that were the case. So, because he certainly was not a half sins person. Also, a Beinoni can't be somebody who has half sins, because even somebody who has even one sin is called a Rasha, which is lower than a Beinoni. So a Beinoni has to be somebody who has no sins, not even a sin of Bittul Torah. Now, the common term that's used, that somebody who's mostly righteous is called a tzaddik, that's a borrowed term in terms of, will they have a favorable outcome in God's judgment or a not favorable outcome? So yeah, a person who has mostly merits can rest assured that they're going to have a favorable outcome. So you don't need to worry that God's going to, smite you because you did a few sins. Okay, you work on it, you work on yourself, but as long as you're doing good things most of the time, there's forgiveness. But the true title of a tzaddik, the true name of a tzaddik, could really only be applied to somebody who has no Yetzer Hara at all, who has totally eradicated the evil from within him, and next week, please God, we're going to go into a deeper understanding of what exactly is this Beinoni, because what we've established so far is that a tzaddik is someone who does not do any sins at all, and so is a Beinoni in thought, in speech, and in action. A Beinoni also does not commit any sins, doesn't even commit the almost impossible thing to avoid, which is to negate a moment of Torah study. So if a Beinoni doesn't even violate that, in what way is he different from a tzaddik? So the answer is, on the outside, there is no difference. They look exactly the same. They behave exactly the same. But the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni is on internal work. And it's on the internal work and where they're holding that belies the difference between a Beinoni and a tzaddik. And so we're going to go through some spiritual anatomy. Next week, we're going to have an anatomy class on spirituality of what exactly is going on inside the Beinoni. So please join us again next week, 12:30 to 1 o'clock. Same time, same platform.